Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this roundtable on the theme of multi-cloud, or the art to manage complexity. I'm Evan French. I manage the cloud transformation team, WCP France. I'm delighted to coordinate this roundtable with 4 speakers. We've got Carlos Gonçalves, Global Chief Information Officer at the Société Générale, also a member of the INCYBER and its administrator. We also have here Vincent Roy, who's RSM security specialist at Splunk. Well, afternoon, everyone. We've got Denis Wendt, principal security researcher for MasterCard from the US, and
talk with us.
And we also have Tobias Hölvart, who's CEO of Sourcing International.
To come in France. Welcome. Ceci étant dit,
having said this, I mean, we're going to deal with the multi-cloud situation. I mean, the roundtable will have a section dealing with some topics and dealt with by the 4 speakers. The idea is to define what the multi-cloud is, talk about the challenge and the complexity of having to deal with the multi-cloud situation and multi-cloud suppliers, different axes of discussion, and we'll close this session with 10 or 15 minutes of discussion where you can ask your questions. We've got French and English speakers at the table, so a part will be held in French, a part will be held in English. So you've got headsets for simultaneous translation, which works quite well. Channel 1 is French, channel 2 is to have English, so don't hesitate to get equipped with those headsets if you need simultaneous translation directly. Having said this, I mean, let's start maybe with a first question about what is the multi-cloud and why the multi-cloud. I mean, maybe Carlos, you want to answer this question first? I think that we can all answer this question, but the question of what is the multi-cloud, I mean, the way it was asked goes beyond public multi-cloud, because very often we list the number of private cloud we've got, but we have mostly the hybrid cloud. I'm not talking about a startup or a company starting with cloud, but for mid-size or large company, we've got legacy, we've got private cloud, and we operate under different jurisdiction. So we've got an obligation to operate our own business, to have an internal cloud. And then we've got public cloud. So the complexity of what we have to manage are several different public clouds operating, interacting with one internal cloud. So the ground question is the security models we're going to have on all these clouds. How do they operate? The regulation we have to comply with in the different countries, and finally the cost to operate a system which is as complex as a private cloud plus one or several public clouds. Thank you. Now, are there any differences now on the French territory or in Europe? I mean, is there an adoption of the multi-cloud situation? Are there any French specificity, Vincent? Yes, I mean, in France, I mean, we can take the metrics that we use, and we could say that 94% of our customers are very cloud, and generally it's 5 cloud suppliers for each of our clients. The more important our client is, the more multi-cloud solutions are provided. The specific case of the Olivet, because we could imagine that OIVs wouldn't go in the cloud. There was a determination to have a total sovereignty, especially for the national health system. The OIV part will be isolated in very small parameters and treated in a specific way, but there's going to be a dichotomy, and all the rest of IT will be hosted in the cloud. That's the specific French part. Okay.
And at the end, do we have the choice of multi-cloud? Can we, why we are going to the multi-cloud? Why we are going to multi-cloud? And is there any, drivers that oblige us, or do we have the choice at the end?
Yes, thank you. For many companies, there really isn't a choice, and I'd like to speak about some of the main drivers behind that. First of all, the business drivers. For my company, MasterCard, a lot of that comes around from acquisitions. We've had a lot of acquisitions over the last several years, many of which are newer companies that are cloud native. We don't want to just switch them over. They're already doing business in a particular cloud. And so we have to deal with that. The other second really driver is a regulatory driver. We're doing business in many countries across the world. Some of them have varying data localization regulations and that drive us to look for various multi-cloud providers. And the last one is a technical one, and that gets into the data and basically classification of the various data and the applications and the different security requirements for each of those. But one thing I would say, if there's not an overwhelming or driving reason for the business reason or regulatory reason or something, or true technical reason to go to multi-cloud, and we'll get into complexity later, there's probably something you shouldn't be looking at. I mean, unless there's something driving you to do it. Multi-cloud for multi-cloud's sake, unless there's really some true requirement, I think will add far too much complexity.
Okay, thank you. And the last question about, putting the perimeter is for Tobias, and Carlos mentioned that a little bit with the size of the company. But maybe Tobias, is there any also difference between companies to companies in these multi-cloud adoptions from your point of view?
Well, from my point of view, there are massive differences between companies, and they come from regulatory requirements or from business needs. So one of my customers is the Austrian Railway, and they have 5 areas. One is maintaining the railway infrastructure. So they try to avoid cloud as much as possible. Another part of that company is rail cargo. They are facing extreme international competition, so they are heavily investing into cloud services. One very extreme example is another customer who is a pipeline operator. They are transporting gas from Hungary border to North Italy. They are NATO protected. They fall under the NIS regulation. But because they had to be outsourced from a multinational gas organization for regulatory requirements about 8 years ago, they had the option of a greenfield approach. Do we build it? Do we do a full outsourcing? They decided to go to a 90% cloud serviced operations, which is very, very unusual for such a company. But for them, it was the best solution at that time to ramp up an IT infrastructure as fast as possible. So yes, there are massive differences. Size-wise, yes, of course, small companies normally are a little bit easier in their decisions, and they have a sort of more flexible approach to the topic, whereas the larger organizations face more regulatory issues, more reputation damage, they have more legacy, and therefore they are a little bit more hesitating because they need to protect their operations.
Okay, thank you. And maybe, as you mentioned, yes, some companies are on the green field, and maybe big companies, it's a bit different. Do you have maybe, Carlos, some example from your big company? I guess multi-cloud, it's not green field. You have lots of existing softwares, and it might be a bit different in your case.
I mean, you summarize it. Je le dis en français.
Ah, excuse me, you can answer in French. Sorry.
Je vais partir en anglais. Évidemment que pour.
Of course, for a very large side company with a legacy, which is rather important, well, getting back to the previous point, if I may, is there a driver to go in the public multi-cloud? No, there's no driver for the public driver, but there's a reality principle, it exists or not, and in some cases there are no public no public clouds in this country, and there's the regulation forbidding you, because we are a bank, so we come under strict regulation. In some countries we cannot operate with a public cloud, so by definition the landscape that we've got is in this scope. So why do we use the public cloud? I think that there are different ways to get there. I think that there are two approaches, those moving fast and those going further. Those who want to go further, I mean, you've got to look at the complexity of your scope, and for a company of our capacity, of our side, to understand the sum total of the regulations and how we organize ourselves to use the cloud in a secure way, led us to be very structured with our trust and control and all the framers that help us to use that safely. How do we use these public clouds, meeting the regulatory demands, our clients' demands? Also, some of our customers might refuse the public clouds. In France, the French client, to see his data in the public cloud in terms of banking data, I mean, is limited. So we've got to take all this into consideration in the way we build our own EC, I mean, what our clients feel like. So for the French clients, I didn't include our French clients in the public cloud. So this reality has got to be taken into consideration. The world, which is getting a little bit more complex, and I'm entering everything into the public cloud. Our reality, which is that of a bank, the regulator, and all this is NIS, and to structure that well, what do we enter into the public cloud or not, is the key point. I mean, what is the right reason why, what is the business case, what is the use case, what is the reason why I'm entering this data into the public cloud. We've experienced the public cloud a long time ago now, and for us, the consumption in a lift and shift mode of the public in the public cloud doesn't work. I mean, the list and shift doesn't work, and it has no value from our standpoint. But a native cloud which is transformed, which keeps the cloud safety model and draws the maximum benefit of the cloud, yes, for some markets it might work. Different usages. And that's the strategy and the way you're going to use the cloud usage that's going to give the landscape you have to face with your business, your regulation, your countries, etc. Thank you all, four of you, because, I mean, it gives us clearly the scope of the multi-cloud dimension. Why do we choose it? Sometimes we choose it, sometimes we don't, depending on the regulation, the country, and the size of the company. Now that we've got this kind of framework, I mean, we've introduced some notion of complexity. Which are the major challenges to be able to operate this multi-cloud? we're thinking about having multiple and diverse security models. I mean, Carlos, maybe if you have elements on that and as to how complex it is to manage those different security models. I don't want to hold the floor. I mean, my colleagues can answer also. If you look at each public cloud, they each have a security model, and you internally, you've got your own security model. So when you start using the public cloud, you've got your own security model that is going to be relevant and consistent with the public cloud security model. So the complexity getting with that is how do you control, how do you implement your own security model? I mean, we made the choice as we have two public clouds to define this security model and make sure that our security policy is well rolled out. Two elements to control when you go into the public cloud: security and compliance. We've got some compliance rule. The trust and control, as we see it, is the sum total of the security issues linked with our operation. We've got other elements of complexity to deal with. Every time you go in the public cloud, you've got the security model, and you've also got the specificity. Each of them have got different specificity. The possibility to source expertise and skilled people familiar with Azure or the Google Cloud means that there's an extreme complexity when you want to manage and to have internally the expertise of all these clouds. So security models, the difficulty to get the necessary skills and competence. The more you multiply the number of clouds, the higher the price, a huge price of all those clouds. And if you start thinking about the data that you're going to enter into the public cloud and thinking about the use case, if you haven't thought about the architecture data, there's a complexity on how you're going to find the use case with data going in Cloud 1, Cloud 2, and Cloud 3, or even in your internal one. So the complexity lies with these 4 points. So you mentioned this notion of competence skills.
About the developer, the engineers, and the team. And maybe, Donny, do you have any maybe experience on that, or how to have the right skills for that? Is it complex to have them?
Sure, yes, and that's probably, in the end, one of the highest costs and expenses involved with it. When we start looking at architecting across this, as we're talking about the different security models for multiple cloud environments. Now, what typically it's, first of all, you have to have that higher level architectural view on your own team as far as the overall security requirements and models across those, but then to actually implement your own security architecture in each of them, you now require security experts, engineers that can actually implement those, that higher level architecture that you've created. And when you throw on top of that the different levels of security, different tiers of security you may need in each one of those providers, because various data requirements or application requirements, that you really start multiplying the expertise required. And some of it will depend on your reasons. So if you're going to one cloud provider for more secure applications, so you're engineering that to a specific requirement versus another one that's maybe you're using for more general use, that's a little easier to deal with. If you're having to try to architect multiple tiers of security across 3 or 4 public clouds, and you have your own internal private cloud as well, that can get quite complex. And just hiring, I'd say, and it's not just finding the engineers then, it's retaining them and that expertise. You know, it's one thing to go out and find them, it's another thing to retain them and keep them.
Okay, so thank you. And the next level after skills is how to organize maybe ourselves or the company in order to tackle this multi-cloud complexity. So it's also maybe a matter of organization and governance. And maybe, Tobias, do you have any experience or example of this kind of complexity related to organization and governance?
I do think that keeping your own organizational governance model is key, because it's not only security, and I fully agree with Carlos, that the more cloud providers you use, the more security models you are confronted with, but it's also the more type of invoices you are getting, or the more SLA reporting you are getting, or whatever, right? So if you believe that an average large organization will probably have 100, 200, maybe 1,000 different cloud services in a few years, not only the big ones, the small ones, two-factor authentication as a service, payment as a service, a little HR tool as a service, a little marketing tool as a service. Can you imagine how complex it becomes to stay on top from an architectural point and a security point of view? And each cloud provider, especially the mature ones, will give you their governance model and their first level support models and their payment and invoicing models. And these models are very mature. But if you have 3, it's getting a little bit more complex, and if you have 10, it is getting quite a challenge. So I think what is really relevant is that first, you define very clearly what kind of responsibility stays with you, and you are not accepting that you have to adopt to a cloud provider model. And secondly, you have to define a use case and a business case that is so heavy that it outweighs the cost of implementing a new cloud service provider. It's a wrong approach to say this cloud service is cool, it has some advantages, it's good for HR. You have to make sure that what you're getting is such a big advantage that the security and operation cost, the cost of managing this additional provider, is much less. And otherwise, don't use it, because it will get into a very chaotic and very difficult and very risky situation, because you either get into a security problem or you get into a cost problem. That's what we can see worldwide at the moment.
Okay. Nous avons parlé un peu de complexité.
We spoke about complexity as far as the competence is concerned, different security model, the governance issue, and the organizational issue. If we move on to the run part, how do we operate? And there's one subject to do with investigation, forensic diagnosis. I mean, how does it work? How can I supervise things? That adds on to the complexity, which is not necessarily a very easy subject. Okay, yes, now we're moving on to the security operations domain. What we find in a SOC, what we can say as a preamble is that a lot of those operations are based on security logs, which are data elements that we handle, or that are handled by the security teams. The difficulty is that as far as the American cloud suppliers, I mean, they haven't had any convergence on this. And we faced, for the security teams, to have a dual issue. First of all, the paradigm has changed, because now we're in the cloud domain. We're talking about using applications more than infrastructure. That means as far as the security teams, they've got to think differently. So there's a whole topic of having been trained around this point. And parallel to that, I mean, when we've got a multi-cloud situation, we've got fragmented data which are not formatted the same, which are not standardized. And obviously that's a difficulty for us to work on this data to make it meaningful. So fortunately, we've made progress on this because technology is maturing. So what we are having now is that we've got some kind of consistent, some kind of convergence between the data models so that we can get back this know-how. Very often we need to subscribe. I mean, the mode where we've got default security by log correction is not automatic. Very often we've got an extra action to recuperate this data, and we're going to find them not on infrastructure issues, but in the usage cases, we're going to base ourselves much more on the issues that we're faced with in the cloud. So to give you ideas, we're going to talk about data loss, data leaks. We're going to talk about wrong configuration, failure to change password, API keys, and we're going to ask the paradigm on this kind of usage. What remains a difficulty is to trace from end to end. They are complex attacks. I mean, there are penetrations which last for years, and through different layers of the SI, and keeping a trace finding a trace remain more difficult in the cloud. Last point, if the cloud is compromised, I mean, we say that it's no longer secure. We have incidents in the cloud, and to compromise the cloud structure has a very important impact. Thanks. One last point. There's the multi-cloud part, and we can go from one cloud provider to the next. And this reversibility element between cloud providers, as we've got a diversity of cloud supervisors, might add to the complexity. So, Carlos, do you have examples on the level of complexity when we want to use this reversibility? What consequences, what challenges does it give us? Reversibility for a security operation, one of the big issue is data processing. So very often we talk about log and incident data. There's going to be huge volumes involved, and the ingress in the cloud, the possibility to extract data represent an important cost. So reversibility brings new issues. What is the simpler is to keep two systems running for a certain time, so that until the logs expire. We're talking about the log, but also detection cases and user cases, the metadata and the security global posture. I mean, all that has got to be borne in mind when we're talking about reversibility. To add on to and give you what we've tried to do, we chose two cloud providers, YAS and PAS, and not SAS. And there are two basic reasons. I mean, the first one is that when you're sticky with one of them, it's very good to have a second one. So from a strategic point of view, our capacity to keep pressure on both cloud providers for a normal size company is very interesting, almost vital, I would say. That helps us to contain the prices and to have a much higher possibility to negotiate. So keeping two cloud providers is almost elementary and necessary for our size company. But to do so, I mean, it's antinomic. It's opposed to the reason we're going into the cloud. We need to organize standards, containers. I'm not going to detail everything. I mean, the way to have some kind of reversibility in what I put in the cloud in a IaaS point of view, and to shift it to the next cloud. But the reason we go to the public cloud is because we're looking for innovation. And if it's innovation, that means that it doesn't exist on the other side. When it becomes complicated is with use cases. I mean, the most profitable ones of them, and we're going to look for something highly differentiating in one specific public cloud. The problem is that we don't have an awful lot of them. And the use cases that we've seen in the public clouds, which are interesting, are those where there's a high usage volatility. So that's quite simple to set at standards. So when you're dealing with topics which are to do purely with the compute storage IS, the standard is very interesting because it allows us for this reversibility. It allows us to keep the capacity, and we've seen that on several occasions with our cloud suppliers. Second topic, which is important, is somehow we're talking about reversibility, but reversibility is necessary for us as a company, but our regulators are demanding. DORA is going to demand it. The DORA regulation will impose some company to have reversibility on the public clouds. So independently as to whether they're operational on the second one, you've got to have your reversibility plan. And to have your reversibility plan in a public cloud, you've got to think about whether you can reinsource. It depends how far you've gone to the public cloud, or public cloud B has got to be able to take over part of the activity you put in the other one. Reversibility and standardized capacity to go to the public cloud is necessary from a strategic point of view, but also from a regulatory point of view for companies which are highly regulated.
Maybe Donny, or reversibility topic or example you want to share?
So I guess from my point of view, it's one of those, it's very, like with most technology, it's far easier to put it in than to pull it back out. That's what I've seen personally. The idea of being able to move from one cloud provider to another, I haven't worked with that directly, moving a particular service from one provider to another. I can imagine it could get quite tricky.
Yeah, sure. Tobias, any reaction or?
Well, I think it will get more and more difficult because if we talk about infrastructure as a service, the providers will do everything to prevent this. Okay, there is a price competition between AWS, Google, and Azure, but what they are doing is they are adding a lot of very interesting microservices around their big services. So the cost to move to another provider is getting very high. It is possible on infrastructure as a service, but the costs are very high. Whereas if I look at most of my customers, like hospitals, they get their cloud services from machines, from Philips. There is no alternative, right? And the gas pipeline I was mentioning very at the beginning, they were going on infrastructure as a service. They were encrypting from the virtual machine level. So yes, of course, they could do the transition, but it took them 1 or 2 years to set it up really well, have the real good managed cloud service providers from Italy. So until everything was set up, all the firewalls, all the internet, the encryption, the SAP system and whatever, it was a huge project with huge cost. And to change that is quite an effort. So what I think is that the SaaS services will grow massively, and these services come with specific features, exactly the features I want, and then the competitors do not have these features. So it's green, but I want it red. And everybody that uses this service in my company want it green. So how can you change to red? I mean, I'm giving a stupid example, but it's the features of a specific service, the reason why you're going there. And of course, every cloud provider tries to be very specific and give a very specific value proposition. So I think we have to understand that there will be a dependency on cloud providers. The dependencies we see at the moment, like coming from Microsoft, where you put Azure together with O365 and you have no chance, which is a monopoly. I think we have to get over that, probably from a regulatory point of view. I hope the European Union will react at a certain point in time. but all the rest will stay. I'm pretty sure. You want a Porsche, you get a Porsche. The Toyota is cheaper and electric. Well, you don't have a Porsche.
Yes.
If I may just to add, je refais en français.
I'll go back to French. I agree with you, and that's what I was saying earlier. Are you going for innovation? The service, do you understand what is the added value? Because the public cloud, the advantage is the fact that you will have more and more added services. And the other way around, and it's true in banks as well as the weather, for example, we have tables of calculation tables, and with tens of thousands of machines to try and calculate our risks. You know, banks have a daily calculation of risks, even real time. So tens of thousands of machines. So we could say, I'm going in this cloud or this supplier, and the cost is so high, but the easy use commodity is so simple, and the standard, the question is, can we distinguish between what we're paying for? The standard that we have put in place, every year we ask again, do I put my computer in Mr. X, Y, or Z? It's not even about the public cloud. We can do even cheaper with other suppliers outside. So the question about what is the standard that I put in place to consume the compute and the storage allows some kind of reversibility. So the question of norm and standard that are imposed in your company for some of your capacities allow you to give you some flexibility. The real question is when you decide to go in a public cloud, and this public cloud brings you a certain service where it's clear that there is an added value for your company, then you're paying and you're conscious of what you're paying. What is a bit difficult, a lot more difficult, you're talking about Office 365 and Azure, is that suddenly you don't have a hand on it anymore. It's gone in a certain way. ChatGPT will come with it, and you don't have a hand on it because the user is coming from outside. You're not able to manage it. Your capacity to define the norm is really what allows you to keep a hand on a referee between left and right. Innovation will still remain something very interesting, but that's why we're going in the public cloud as well.
Is the biggest driver, right? My hospital clients told me until before the pandemic, never ever. They had a red card that was that big, patient data, no. And then suddenly they said, well, Philips is selling us these machines, and they have a cloud and artificial intelligence, and they match our blood values with million other blood values. So you have better data for your patients, and suddenly they are getting a little bit weak. And I completely agree to Carlos that what is really the nice thing is that cloud providers constantly, normally improve their services. They add little features that are really cool. But that's again the good and the evil. Some of these features might be cool, but you don't want them. So coming from a bank point of view, for example, a colleague of mine told me that it took him 6 months to convince the labor union of his banking IT environment, a very large organization, that Teams is acceptable. And everybody was happy, and under certain specific frameworks, they were allowed to implement that. And 6 months later, the labor union came to him furious and accused him of being not transparent because they found out that Microsoft has implemented, I'm not doing Microsoft bashing, it's just an example, right? Has implemented a new feature with facial recognition in Teams so that you can jump to recorded sessions and find the places where Carlos is speaking, which is really cool. From a GDPR point of view, it's not cool. Yeah, you don't want it. And my friend said it was really embarrassing for me because I tried to get that organization into these new tools. I negotiated between Microsoft and the labor union, and we find a good balance. And suddenly I'm the bad guy because I didn't tell them early enough that things are changing, because, as Carlos said, I don't have the hand on it. I need to read these updates, these weekly updates, very, very carefully to find out if there is a specific feature going to disappear, or a new feature which is really cool, but maybe an additional risk. And I think that is what cloud management, what makes cloud management such a challenge and such an expensive thing to do.
Ok, merci beaucoup. Et alors, du coup, c'est une bonne transition parce qu'on
Thank you very much. And it's a good transition because we saw in the challenges that there's a compromise between innovation, and that's the idea of going for innovation with the cloud providers, but there's the risk of being dependent on these services. So are there perhaps solutions or best practices to allow us to have a balance between the trade-off between the being benefiting from innovation and perhaps being less dependent? And perhaps Donny, on this side, as you were preparing the roundtable, you were talking about a few of these things, perhaps.
Yes, and I think from my view, a lot of it, and I guess there's a big difference in my thinking between somewhere where I'm doing software as a service versus truly having a multi-cloud environment. And when we're getting into the multi-cloud environment, I'm looking at how do I create that overall internal architecture in a way that is as agnostic as possible for these various clouds. Now that requires me to have a high-level architectural expertise that understands the security capabilities and weaknesses of each of those cloud providers, so that then I can fashion my security requirements around that and my architecture. But then I've got to have the very detailed implementation, because when it comes to actually implementing your security architecture on each of these cloud providers, and it can get very it could require a lot of very low-level understanding of how they operate. There's no button you push, it says secure this cloud provider, right? And you get down and it kind of goes into those features, because in this case, it's security features that are added or changed. And now you've got to make sure you're keeping up with your security implementation in that particular cloud environment when that occurs. So I think it's having that overall, first of all, having an overall security architecture that also takes into account the different types of data classification, different security requirements for each of your apps, and then figuring out now how do I implement those particular requirements that I have in each given cloud provider. And it may be that one of them you can't meet the particular security requirements for this particular application in Cloud A. So you may have to then put it in Cloud B based upon that, right? But you should have that framework in place when you're dealing with a multi-cloud environment, where you have your overall architecture and you're mapping your specific data requirements, your application requirements to the security capabilities of those various environments.
Ok, thank you. And Carlos, vous avez mentionné aussi.
Carlos, you talked about some norms and standards, and obviously there's also something relating to logs and traces. For Vincent, perhaps this allows us to create some homogeneity between these elements. Yes, as we were saying earlier, there is hope on these operational procedures. In terms of logs and traces, there are two big categories. First is the basic data for the logs. So the existing standards for the Techno on-prem were enriched to take into account new specificities. So I can mention, for instance, CIM, which allows to take the norm and to normalize it, the standard, and normalize it, and CF in ArcSight and HP, Leaf in QRadar, and all these formats allow you to take some information from the multi-cloud and try and structure it. This is from the data point of view. The next problem, it's based on use cases. How can we model the security alerts that will be launched? And we have more and more demands from our clients to have a system that is agnostic, that allows us to have reversibility, to look at different clouds. So we look at Sigma rules that are quite used. There's SPL and Splunk that's used. So we have more and more specific elements where we can use detection tools that come from the cloud, and we will put all of these logs and alerts together in one posture of detection, which will be quite unique. As we were saying earlier, these create new challenges, but obviously there isn't just one standard at the moment. I was looking at the way we were discussing this round table, and we're talking about all difficulties with the public cloud or the cloud, but it's a huge opportunity, and perhaps we should look at it the other way around. And it will be here, it will stay there, and it will really shape the way we work. And so what we have to ask ourselves is, how can we structure it the best way to take most advantage of the innovation potential that's really incredible? So at the base of this is to really be clear on all the risks in terms of compliance, security. And I was thinking, what are some of the security violations or flaws that are on the public cloud? And for most of them, they're not really flaws of the public cloud, they're just bad implementations of the public cloud. As we were saying earlier, we didn't have the relevant expertise to understand how these services work. We left some developers with little experience use services, and so we found that we had data that was exposed in the cloud. So it's really a great tool, and the real question is, are we able to manipulate this tool in the best possible way and take the best part of it for our companies, for our organization? And that's the risk that we have to balance. So I don't want to go against it. So I don't want to say I want to stop going in the public cloud. No, we should go even more into it. We have to train our teams. We have to structure them. We have to have a holistic approach to understand why are we going in the public cloud. And we have to be conscious, obviously, of the risks that it can bring. And sometimes these are risks that we take without even being aware of them. So on one hand, these are the standards that you put in place with your teams, but also the controls and the checks. So the real question is, do you have the standards in place, and are you going to check whatever you're putting in the public cloud in terms of respecting the security norms and the regulations? And as Monsizo would say, is it secure by design? So I encourage you perhaps more in this direction, looking at the cloud more with a positive attitude, because we have a lot to gain from it.
The reason why the cloud is growing that much is not only because we are pushed into it, it is very attractive. So let's take another example. It could be very attractive to become a private pilot and be able to fly little planes on the weekend. So this is very risky and very attractive. How we approach it? Well, we go to a school, we learn it, we have trainings, we invest a lot of time, we learn a lot of pages, we do exams, then finally we are allowed to fly it, and we always keep ourselves updated what is changing with the plane, and we have to be reassessed and do tests every year. So it is more or less the same with cloud, with two differences. One difference is that nobody is asking us whether we would like to use the cloud. It's here, it's there, it will be like that. And the second thing is, nobody has the chance to think, do I have enough time and resources to do it? Now, I know no company that has enough resources to manage multi-cloud, at least right now. Maybe in France it's different, but I have not seen any. Also the big ones, always too little resources. They all have too many projects, and it's very difficult to get that know-how from the market at the moment. So what do you do if you have a risky, very challenging situation with little resources? You cut the elephant until you can eat it. So you have draw down the expectations and start small scale. You define the use case, you define the business case, you implement a cloud center of excellence, you implement a first governance structure with decision-making processes. You define clear models of shared responsibilities because the cloud provider does not deliver everything what you need. So you need to add services on top, value-added services. Which are the ones that are most important for you? Is it first-level support? Is it financial management? Is it technical support? Are you doing the change management, the incident management, the disaster recovery? You will get a long list of tasks that you want to do, and it's very clear you can't do them all right now. So you do a roadmap. You take the most important ones, the most urgent ones, and you try to invest money, time, resources, people, trainings into these elements to make them available. And the next ones in 6 months or in 12 months. And if you have enough resources, you can do it faster or you can take a little bit more time. That's the way how I think all organizations need to approach that challenge of limited resources, but a train that is running already very fast.
Thank you. Peut-être Vincent, et puis ensuite on va avoir un peu de temps pour prendre.
Vincent, perhaps, and then we'll have some questions. Yes, I wanted to go back on the idea on the ray of light before the end of the round table. We didn't talk about the new possibilities. For example, the request that we have is to have an elastic system that can scale up and when we have abnormal phenomenons so that we're able to face these. Also in terms of capacity of calculation and resource allocation, we talk about machine learning and behavioral, and this really opens up new horizons to have more elements for our work and security. So definitely there's a lot of positive, obviously. I hope that this exchange, this roundtable allowed us to have a clear idea on the multi-cloud, and we have a bit of time. We have 8 minutes to take some questions. I don't know if some of you in the hall want to ask questions.
Oui, alors, yeah. Ouais, ça marche. Je vous l'amène, désolé. Alors.
I'm bringing you the microphone. Thank you. Thank you for this very interesting dialogue. We talked earlier about IIS service platform. With use of cloud, we have more SAS and SAS exchanges. I wanted to know, what is your vision of security on these kinds of exchanges that are difficult to control, especially because we don't have enough vision and logs on this service? SAS. Yes, on the subject of logs, I can give you some ideas. Machine to machine, because that's the kind of exchange we're talking about. When I was saying earlier, everything will depend on the analysis of risk that we want to address and the use cases that we will put in front of this to detect this. These create problems, and this has been there for a while though. So we've had some more extensive use cases that require us to work on standardization and map the risks and use cases to be more pertinent.
Answer the question, is okay? No? Est-ce qu'il y a une autre question?
Are there any other questions in the room?
Moi, j'ai une question par rapport.
I have a question. I will be a bit rude. we talked about costs earlier. Is there also fine FinOps aspects, so to be able to measure a little bit the cost of multi-cloud, to have a clear vision of the different costs spent on different cloud provider solutions that your companies, is there a complexity linked to this? And are there elements of a solution to help other businesses to measure these costs in a more homogeneous way, perhaps?
I'm going to give only a very short answer. I think what we can expect is providers that will deliver add-on services that support exactly these kind of questions. And there are providers outside in the world, especially regarding licensing managing or cost managing, that they're delivering a certain aspect of managed cloud service provider solutions, right? But to conclude, a banking customer of mine, he recently said, I expect that the cost of managing Microsoft Teams is factor 50 of the Teams license. Now, Teams is not too expensive in the package, but factor 50 is quite a big number, 50-fold. And I think he's right. Managing Teams in a complex environment with people outside the company, maybe exchanging documents as well, is exposing a security and a GDPR risk, and you need to implement all kind of measurements, and that is not free of charge. It will cost resources of your IT organization. So I think, yes, the costs that are on top of cloud service licensing is completely underestimated at the moment. Carlos, what is your point on it?
Well, absolutely. As a bank, I've already said it a few times, we're very standardized, and we have, our staff is very standardized. So any exchange between some operators, whatever this exchange may be, phone, Teams, everything has to be recorded. We have to be able to reproduce to our supervisors any exchange in order to avoid any kind of malicious operations within the system. We have to be able to reproduce these elements. So as you can imagine, if you introduce Teams, you are forced to structure the recording capacities of all the interactions of whatever bank you're dealing with. Even worse, if you send a document in Teams with a link, you have to be able to look at all the links linked to this, all the documents linked to this. So the question of multiplication of tools and exchange tools really creates a whole other level of cost as well. But what do we feel? What is the alternative? There is no alternative. And luckily, we've had Teams and Zoom during COVID. Companies would have died otherwise. But we have the same debate. So the question as to, are these tools bringing a new cost to the company? Yes, of course. I don't know if we are aware of the consequences of COVID and remote workers and how the company and the collaborator is working, but it's a number of possibilities that are quite exceptional. And perhaps it's the same discussion we were having earlier regarding the cloud, to take the example of Teams, that it's a tool. And we have to understand the wholesomeness of the tool and how it's integrating into the business and into your regulation. And I agree with Tobias. It brings a new cost, and we have to be aware of this, because if you don't control it, you'll discover it later. So I share completely the Tobias's remark. It has to be regulated, but it's a huge opportunity.
We
started talking about the cost part of it. For several years ago, I was in the kind of the cutting edge of the security automation orchestration field when that was starting to take off, and I was asked to do a lot of presentations on it. And I'd always start the presentation with, why are you doing the automation? Why are you doing orchestration automation? If it's to save money, leave, because that's not what you're going to do. Stop now. It's not about saving the money. It is because of all those other costs. Sure, the costs are worth it if you know what they are going in. And a lot of times what I found, and it's the same thing, is that these new technologies are first pushed as a cost savings, and you really got to push back on that, because there's a lot of, you have to understand your own business and what the costs are to it. For instance, we talked earlier about having the multiple experts in each of these clouds. It's the ongoing training of these multiple experts in these clouds. It's all of the other business processes, the governance processes and that you're going to have to put on top of it. That's the larger cost typically. And I think a lot of times it's given, unfortunately, people, I think, try to put together a business case that looks good, that shows a cost savings, when in actuality, in the long run, it probably won't be. And that's not why you're doing it. You're doing it for the business benefit, the innovation benefit. That's what's driving it, not cost.
Merci beaucoup. Donc,
Thanks a lot. I mean, we're getting to the end of this session. Dead on time. Well, I would like to thank Carlos, Vincent, Denis, and Tobias. Thanks a lot for your presentation. And thanks to you remotely viewing this on the multi-cloud, and have a nice session. Thank you.